All right, so let's now bring in Fred Arendse, President of the Junior Mining Council, for his analysis and his reaction. Fred, a very good afternoon to you. Thank you so much for your time. So 3 weeks since that mud rush, the first of the miners trapped nearly 900 meters underground, now retrieved. From a mining and rescue perspective, I mean, what does the stage of the recovery operation tell us about the conditions underground, as we get your reaction, of course, to this first retrieval?
Good afternoon. Thank you very much, Jonati. I'm very happy, to hear, but equally also sad because there's still 4 miners trapped underground.
Yeah.
But I must also, say well done to the team that has been working tirelessly, doing what they need to do despite the difficult, conditions, both, physical conditions underground, but also conditions caused by weather. But I must say, the tirelessness is paying off. And it's very sad, for the 5 families involved. But at least, these efforts is 3 weeks, start to pay off, and at least one of the 5 families, can find some comfort that they was able to retrieve their loved ones. And we continue hoping and praying, for the remaining, 4, colleagues that bodies are still trapped underground. I think it's probably safe to say that we can now assume, that the other 4, might not be alive, and we remain hopeful that the team will be able to retrieve them.
Yeah, I'm hoping you can, give us some light, in your experience. Are mud rushes generally, preventable through engineering controls or maybe even monitoring systems? Or are they sometimes unavoidable events? I mean, a mud rush is not something that many of us will understand immediately. So in simple terms, what exactly happens inside a mine when a mud rush occurs? Fred, maybe you can help us with that. I know, of course, that this is not the first disaster that you have been very closely dealing with, including, of course, the Lily mine disaster.
Yeah. It's with the mud rush, it's very difficult. It's unlike, like when you have a rock fall, when you have a mud rush, it happens very, very fast. And your ability to get away from it is very slim. And yes, there is always, mines has got their monitoring mechanism, monitoring systems. But, like any accident, it's very, very difficult, you can do all your systems, but when it happens, it happens. And I don't want to speculate, the causes of this particular mud rush because the investigation hasn't commenced. And I would rather, reserve my view until we have a full understanding of what was the failures. But in general terms, it's very, very difficult. It is possible to predict. And you have the monitoring systems that give you some level of data, some level of prediction. But unfortunately, when it happens, your chances of preventing that, it is very, very slim. And that is what we have seen, been happening at this particular mine. And it is why, it is about 3 weeks, that the guys has been battling, to get access, and to find these bodies because, and I can't, if I can visualize it, you can imagine if you find, 3-4 meters of mud, in 4x4, tunnels, it's extremely difficult.
Yeah. Following this disaster, in fact, immediately following this disaster, Ekapa Minerals announced, of course, its liquidation process just over a week after that mud rush, leaving potentially over 1,200 people without work. I mean, how unusual is it for a mine to collapse financially in the middle of, an active disaster recovery operation? And what does it mean for the workers?
Yeah. I was a bit surprised when about this liquidation, and because normally what happens if a mine goes into distress, the board will obviously consider all viable options, before they take any specific commercial or corporate action. And normally, I was hoping that they will maybe consider, like a business rescue if they've been experiencing some financial, distress. The normally companies will consider business rescue, sort of liquidation. And I find it strange that there is already a provisional liquidation order because it was only announced 3 weeks ago that the mine consider liquidation, because normally what must happen from a legal process, that you apply for provisional liquidation and then there's a hearing and people get an opportunity to oppose. And I mean, I would assume that NUMSA would have opposed a liquidation. So I'm not 100% sure whether in fact there's a provisional liquidation order. But again, we're not certain whether the mine has been in distress prior to the accident. I mean, that hasn't been forthcoming. But in normal, circumstances, the mines would normally first consider, a business rescue, before, they consider an extreme action of a provisional liquidation.
And I mean, I just want to look at the broader implications too. I mean, in towns like Kimberley, a single mine can anchor, the entire economy or local economy of that particular city. What happens to broadly the community when over 1,000 workers suddenly then potentially lose their livelihoods, just like that? I mean, particularly when you look at too, in terms of the sector and what that means for the diamond or the mining sector in the main.
Yeah. The social impact on the community as a result of this, I mean, it is disastrous. It is very, very painful. And I can also relate my experience with my involvement in Lily Mine for the last 9 years. I mean, it's a major effect on the community and the employees, in this case, almost ex-employees, but also, local businesses that were supplying the mine. And that is, the primary impact, but there's also secondary impact of other social challenges that might come from that, and some of it could relate into crime, because now people don't have jobs, and so there's a potential of the town's community will experience some form of increase in crime. And it is why I was respectfully challenging our minister 2 weeks ago that I believe that the government should do more, and we compliment the Premier for his efforts. But as a national government, I really, wish to encourage, the Department of Mineral Resources and the national government, to come out and provide, additional support, to the affected people.
Yeah, and I'm glad you answered that last part, because I was going to then ask you in terms of, government's role here, particularly when it comes to just vetting some of these mining companies before they start operations. And of course, importantly, what happens when these operations do close down. But Fred, thank you so much for your comments. Really appreciate your time. Fred Arendse is the president of the Junior Mining Council, of course, just responding there to our breaking news story that you see there on your screen.